Hi, and welcome to Office Hours 14. I'm here with Tiffany Wong and with Philip Gant, who studies Korean history and Chinese history and is involved in this as well. First thing I think was the fact that people really appreciated Bai Chen-shun's calligraphy and Ren Wei's account of Wang Shizhi's Lan Tingshu, the Orchid Pavilion preface, most famous early work of calligraphy, and Professor Alistair Ingalls' demonstration of calligraphy.
We were very appreciative that people actually submitted, including using very creative methods of writing, including Western calligraphy pens and crayons and brushes.
Wow. So Sam Yu, Khan 1717, Boni Yu, Anita Suk, Barclay de Tali Sherwan, thank you all very much. And you have a new feature. You have a Zoom feature?
Yes.
So people had questions?
We had a number of interesting lingering questions, but maybe we'll start with just one about Professor Inglis's calligraphy. Why is the calligraphy he reproduced called the slender gold script? And they wanted to know where the word gold is coming from. Is the paper gold and that's why we're calling it that, or what?
That's a challenge. I'm not sure I can answer that. It's called Shojinti, slender gold script, or slender gold style. But actually it is connected to Emperor Huizong in the Sung Dynasty. What's interesting about that script is it and I actually have a piece of it in my office, done by Alistair Ingalls. And when people come into my office, they look at it and say, wow, you have Emperor Huizong's calligraphy. Now, Alistair Ingalls began as an artist, but he actually is also a really skilled calligrapher. But the thing about slender gold script is that it's really easy to imitate. And so we think that one of the things that must have been going on with Emperor Huizong is that the scribes were producing lots and lots of things in his handwriting because it was so stylized, it was easy to imitate. And you'll see that there are other calligraphers, whether it's Xu Bing, who we'll talk about in a minute, or Yan Zhenxing, who we'll talk about later, they're not so easy to imitate. So in any case,
Easy to imitate.
Easy to imitate is very important, right? But I don't know why it's called gold. Do you know?
I think, he came up with the name.
Yeah, emperors like gold,
And
so yeah.
I think it's potentially because it looked kind of like gold filament. It's twisting and bending, and so they thought maybe that's why.
Okay, that makes sense. So we had 3 discussion questions today. And the first was on this question of Xu Bing and his land script.
Whether you considered it to be calligraphy or not, and why. So
Okay.
we had a number of interesting answers, right?
Yes, we had some really great answers and some very strong opinions on this. So there are a fair amount of people who really thought it was calligraphy, and a fair amount of people who really thought it was art and not calligraphy, and some people who thought it was both.
Okay.
And I think they drew some very interesting comparisons both to Western poetry and to Western art, mentioning Magritte's painting of the pipe and pointillism technique. Marga 86 mentioned that she thought it was much like pointillism, but instead of using points to create a landscape, he used characters. Tina thought that it was a way to kind of go back to the true roots of calligraphy by bringing it back to the origins. And J.M. Worsley made some really interesting connections to Ming Xiang, Wang Bi's Ming Xiang, on his commentary of the I Ching.
So Wang Bi, I know Wang Bi lived in medieval China. Ming Xiang.
Ming Xiang, the section, understanding the images.
And the I Ching is one of the Confucian classics, right? The classic of change.
Yeah.
So Wang Bi is writing a commentary
Yeah.
on the Confucian classic.
Yes.
Remember how you talked about that
Yes.
earlier on in one of the
Yes.
early modules?
Yeah.
Great.
And so if you want a reminder, you can go back.
But there are a whole bunch of people here who responded. M.J. Hamilton, B. Box, Kitty Pong, Sweezy, Veritas 98, Tim P.B., Rosanna F., Arnold C.L., Smartita. Now there's a second question, wasn't there?
Which was about traditions of calligraphy or penmanship in your own countries.
Yeah, so we had actually responses from all over the world. One of the great things that Professor Kirby and I love about this course is the fact that you are all over the world. Over 70% are outside of the United States. So we have Purple Candy talking about an ancient script in the Philippines prior to the arrival of the Spanish. And of course, JLPH talks about ancient Egypt, right? Very important. And the Egyptians, of course, also begin with a hieroglyphic system. Italy in the Middle Ages, Montbelli points out, paid with the Amunensi, the scribes, paid enormous attention to calligraphy. In fact, there are European traditions of calligraphy, with using different kinds of pens and things like this. Eunice Wasaki talks about Japanese calligraphy influenced by China, and the shodo, the way of writing. And people today, even very popular still to go to calligraphy masters and learn calligraphy in Japan. Christine J.M. talks about Arabic, and in fact, in the Islamic world, calligraphy is so important because you're not supposed to use images, and so calligraphy becomes a major form of art, as Christine points out. Tito Flasch, also on Islamic calligraphy. Murray Rosenbaum, the ballpoint pen has changed everything, he said. There's something to that, I think. Jim Donahue, cursive was very much alive throughout my college years, but it's vanished with the advent of the computer. So it's true. You know, one of the things that we found in teaching Chinese, that when I was younger, we always had to, if you had to write characters, you had to write them out. But today, if you know the pronunciation, you can type it into the computer, and the computer does the character. And active memory of characters seems to be failing a bit. The last one was from New Zealand with Tamoko, who talked about facial tattoos as another kind of calligraphy, another kind of art. I thought it was pretty cool, right?
Yeah, there was a fascinating point there about people who steal designs being cursed as a result, which I thought is a good thing to think about in terms of our lecture about, you know, if you wanted to get good, if you wanted to be a master, as you mentioned in the introductory video, you had to learn the styles and the canon of calligraphy. Whereas here, I'm kind of curious about how facial tattoo artists would learn the language of this topic.
Right, if you can't imitate it. Fiona BX, thank you very much. So the last thing in this piece of Yen Jianqing's calligraphy, you can sort of, you may recall that here in color. Now, this was what's called in Chinese a jiwen. It's a piece you write on after somebody's death, and it's sort of like an offering. And it's called a draft. He calls it a draft, or we call it a draft of the requiem or the eulogy for his nephew. Written in the year 758. What happened in the year? Does that matter?
Oh, it matters a lot. So as we've discussed in the earlier portions of the module, and there's a bit to come, the Anlushan Rebellion, the transformative moment in imperial Chinese history, in which we had we had basically the total chaos in the Tang that resulted in the changes that came about in later Tang.
Right. So Yen Jianqing, who's known as one of the great calligraphers of Tang, who's also a high official and historian as well, his nephew and his cousin die in the rebellion. The whole clan, in fact, at one place, the 30 in all perished. Yes. And this happened, it's not the first time it's happened in Chinese history or the last time it happened. But what did people have to say? Because what we wanted to know is, what does it say about the personality and the circumstances of the author?
Right. It was a really fascinating and enlightening discussion that came about, and many of you sort of found or suspected that this was a draft, which was really fascinating, encouraging. Albert Esses, for example, just asks right away if it's a draft before a final text, but then mentions corrections that he's noticed, right? And at least it's showing that calligraphy is not easy. which I liked, and he compares it again to a Jewish tradition to write a Torah scroll. When one letter is not in place, the whole scroll becomes invalid. So it's an interesting idea. The other thing that I really appreciated Albert doing was going back and posting what he learned from the extra materials that we'd split up, and going back and discussing with the rest of the discussion board what he had learned from the materials at the National Palace Museum. So thank you so much, Albert. And we also had somebody notice the characters in there referring to the Aleutian Rebellion, which was great. That was Chimori. We had this Dubo Ai Shalb, giving the impression that this encompasses a long history of learning and tradition, and noticing that there might be some rookie mistakes to avoid. Lachlan D talks about the hastiness noticed here. Thin, not very bold calligraphy, which is, of course, a constant part of the discussion in calligraphy. Obvious alterations and annotations, but notes that the characters seem to be correctly rendered. We had Nancy, who was troubled by the sort of the bold, emotive strokes, messy writings that on closer examination, she notes, seem to be editing changes, and makes the very important point, I think, that the writer seems to be, just by looking at what we've given you without any explanation, determines that the writer seems to be making up
very angry and upset,
making up the mind many different times within the piece, which is fascinating. And then we have some agreement here on Simon Cole's point, who talks about the emotion that's inherent, that you can all read, and gives the theory at the end that the writer may be slightly inebriated, either with emotion or with wine, a theme that's carried on by Jake Piper, who talks about the personality, the different sorts of personality that's revealed here in the use of ink, in the composition. And that was just a wonderful discussion that touched on a lot of themes.
I think the other really interesting thing about Jake Piper was that he thought he was quite confused why there would be so many seals on this piece, and I think a lot of people brought this up, that there were so many seals on it, but they couldn't quite understand why. And he had an interesting theory. He thought maybe it was Mao Zedong's work, and or a really great poet, and it was for the poetry or the content that they were sort of acknowledging with these seals.
And the last one is Lu Sleep, who wrote in Chinese, that this calligraphy, this is one of the regarded as a masterwork of Chinese calligraphy, precisely because of the emotionality of the piece, and this sense of the that sort of the energy, the force that comes through, and the way in which he's using the brush, that it really enters a more ethereal realm almost. Yeah, next week I'm going to be in Taiwan, and on March 11th, Tuesday, from 3 to 5, I'll be talking at the Guojia Tushiguan, the National Library. Part of the talk is going to be about using research online using the China Biographical Database. Other parts going to be about ChinaX, and Yuan, who's helped us in the past, will be there to help with that part as well. So if you're in Taipei on March 11th at 3 o'clock and you're free from 3 to 5, go to the Guojia Tushiguan and we'll get a chance to meet. Okay. Now next week we're not going to have too much lecture next week. We're going to be reading a story, right? And this story is the most famous love story in Chinese history. See you then. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.